Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to talk today about the question of values in qualitative data collection. And I'm first going to motivate my choice of topic a little bit, and then I'm going to give you a more detailed introduction to what it is I'm going to say. So, the debate on the role of values in science has been very lively lately. And the debate tends to revolve around or take its starting point in the idea of value-free science. And this is a very old idea, and there are also different versions of it, but here you get one main version of it. And the idea then states that non-epistemic values, so moral, social, political, these kind of values, should not influence the collection and interpretation of data and the drawing of conclusions on the basis of these data. So, in the current debate on values in science, a number of objections to this ideal have been advanced, and they are currently being discussed. So there's the argument from underdetermination, the argument from inductive risk. They are probably the two most commonly discussed objections. And then in the wake of this criticism, there has also been a number of alternative ideals for values in science proposed. So these are a response then to the fact that this ideal of value-free science, it doesn't really seem to capture correctly the roles of values in science. So we need to formulate some kind of new ideal that better captures how we should handle all these values or all these values that might influence the scientific process. So from my perspective, there are two noteworthy features. And one of them is that this whole current debate on the values and on the role of values in science has focused mainly on natural scientific research. So very little focus on the social sciences and the humanities. And another distinctive feature of the current debate is that it has focused in particular on the role of values when accepting or rejecting hypotheses. So it's one moment, you can say, in the scientific process that has been given a lot of attention. So I'm going to take a very different approach or adopt a very different focus, because I want, first of all, to look at the role of values in data collection. So this is another phase in research than the phase where you decide whether to accept or reject a hypothesis. And I want also to focus on qualitative data collection. And qualitative data collection methods are widely used in the social sciences and also in the humanities. So it's a different type of science that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to make 3 points. I'm going to say that if we try to answer this question, then what is the proper role of values in qualitative data collection? We must arrive at the conclusion that, well, the ideal of value-free science, if we apply it to qualitative data collection, it should be rejected. Then you may say, well, maybe we knew that. There's been a lot of criticism of this idea. Let's go for some of the alternative ideas. I'm going to look at 3 alternative ideas too and argue, no, they don't work either. So I end up somewhat on a negative note because I conclude that we need to develop an ideal for the role of values in qualitative data collection. You could say it's a negative conclusion, but you could also be excited about it because then there's a lot of interesting work to be done here. So I guess it depends on your temperament. Okay, so here's how I'm going to proceed. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is then qualitative data collection. Then I'm going to discuss, what does it look like when we apply the idea of value-free science to qualitative data collection. And I present you with my objections to this ideal applied to qualitative data collection. And then I go for the alternative ideals, reject them too, and then also say a bit at the end about how we might go about the task of developing a new ideal. Okay, so, okay, it's because it showed a box here on my screen, but apparently not on yours. Okay. Okay, no, it's wanted to do some, I don't know what it's, some task, but I asked it to postpone it. Okay, so quantitative data collection methods, there are a variety of them, but I think that the three most commonly used are participant observation and then semi and unstructured interviews. So participant observation, it's a method that's really probably the defining method of cultural anthropology, but it's also used in a lot of other social sciences and sciences in the humanities. And the basic idea here is that the researcher goes out to the people she wants to study. She tries to some extent to take part in their activities, their ways of life, while interfering as little as possible, because otherwise it would defeat the purpose of being there, right? You are there to learn about the ways of life you study, not to change them. And then while you participate, you observe, so you simply take notice of what's going on. Then you have semi and unstructured interviews. Here, the researcher asks questions, while then encouraging the interviewees to, say, expand on responses, to digress, to exemplify. They may introduce their own concerns, and so on and so forth. Semi-structured interviews are a little more directed. The researcher has a little more, has more of a plan in this kind of interview, maybe prepared a few questions and so on. Whereas the unstructured interview, it comes very close to simply a normal conversation, even though, of course, the researcher has a certain purpose with this conversation. So the aim of these qualitative methods is basically the same. You want to produce data that allow you to understand the research participants' experiences, their perspectives, their attitudes, their values. So your data about these experience, views, and so on are always the starting point of analysis. But of course, in the final analysis, you may well go beyond the experiences, criticize their attitudes, and what have you. Now, qualitative methods have a number of features in common in the way they are commonly employed. So I'm stressing the way they are commonly employed because you can use these methods in somewhat different ways. But if you look at the standard tradition for using them, then they have the features that I'm going to enumerate now. One feature is that you typically start out with a rather unspecific and open question. So you may start out with a question like, how did Danes respond to the economic crisis? How do people feel about the latest changes in the labor market? How do immigrants cope with the stressful situation? It's kind of very open-ended. It's unclear what exactly will be the answer to these questions, and there are a variety of directions you can go in order to answer them. Then in qualitative research, you start out with a question, but you may very well change it while you're in the field collecting your data. So you may render it more precise, that's very standard, but you may also change it in other ways, and you can even completely discard it in favor of a different question. Also, when you go out and collect your data, you only have a rough idea of what kinds of data you should collect prior to going out in the field. So if you're interested in people's view on religion, of course, you know that you might need to talk to people about this topic, but exactly who you will talk to and what situations and events of a religious thought you would like to be present in and so on, that's undecided. And then the fourth feature has to do with the way the social researcher interacts with the research participants. What is distinctive here is that you navigate in the research participant social world. And that's because when you carry out participant observation, you go out to the research participants, you try to somehow participate in their ways of life. And likewise, when you carry out interviews, you typically carry out interviews in the research participants' own settings. And the way you interact with people, it's not like there's some kind of mechanical standardized method or a way of proceeding you have to follow. Your interactions with research participants are quite informal. I mean, you're trying to blend in here. You're trying to make things come very close to ordinary conversations. This means that since you typically carry out these methods over an extended period of time and talk to people several times, hang around in their settings for very long, you develop personal relationships with the people and very commonly friendships. I'm going to return to these features later on when I discuss the role of values in qualitative data collection, because they actually have consequences for the role that values play here. Okay, so let me now introduce you to the ideal of value-free science applied to qualitative data collection. So if we reformulate the ideal of value-free science so that it's only focused on this particular phase in research, namely data collection, then we get the following ideal. Non-epistemic values should not influence qualitative data collection. So this means that the decisions you take while you're in the field collecting your data should not be influenced by like moral, political, social, personal, aesthetic values. So you shouldn't, for instance, let your political views determine that you only want to talk to certain participants and then you disregard the others because you disagree with them politically. I mean, that would be very bad style. And that would be prohibited by the ideal of value-free science. Okay, so there's a kind of accompanying idea to this ideal of value-free science applied to qualitative data collection. And it is that only epistemic values should influence qualitative data collection. So non-epistemic values, they are typically regarded as undesirable because they somehow impede the production of scientific knowledge. By contrast, the epistemic values, they are considered desirable. They should influence the way you go about doing science. So one way to put it is that epistemic values are desirable features of data sets, of hypotheses, of theories. So the whole debate on values in science has been very focused on the acceptance and rejection of hypotheses. So in the literature, you can find long lists of epistemic values that should have an impact or influence these kind of choices. But because there's not been so much attention given to data collection, there are no similar lists of epistemic values that should guide the researcher in this phase of research. Now, this is of course a pity, but it's no catastrophe, because we can of course try to come up with what might seem reasonable epistemic values to pursue in this context. And I think that a proponent of the value-free ideal as applied to qualitative data collection might want to go for two epistemic values at the very least. And one is the value of relevance and the other the one of balance. So it is a desirable feature of data that they are relevant relative to the research question you are looking into. So what this means is that, I mean, we would like to have data that can somehow be used as a basis for an answer to our research question. I mean, that should be pretty uncontroversial, I think. The other thing is we would like a balanced data set. So balance is a desirable feature of our data set. And by this, I mean that if you say, okay, I want to look into what is the attitude to abortion in this community. Well, if you only talk to young women, well, it's not obvious that you will get a balanced data set, right? You might also want to talk to people from the older generation. You might also want to talk to both female and male. You might perhaps want to talk to some who are religious, some who are not religious, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I know that there is a lot more to be said about these two values, but I think that, I mean, they are intuitively understandable, and I'm just giving them to the proponent of the ideal of value-free science, and then see how that will work out. So now I want to do this scanning again, and let me see if I can. Okay. So, okay. Okay. So I'm now going to move on to my objections to this proposal that the ideal of value-free qualitative data collection should be adopted. So, as I've already indicated, there are a lot of decisions being made while you are out in the field collecting your qualitative data. And I'm simply going to focus on two of these decisions. And one decision has to do with whether or how you should change your research question. Should you render it more precise, modify it in other ways, or adopt a completely new question? The other question has to do with what data to collect, right? What situations do you actually go for when you're out there in the field? Who do you talk to, and what do you ask them to exemplify, and so on? These are all decisions about what data to collect. What I'm going to argue is that non-epistemic values have both required and permissible roles to play in connection with both these decisions. So I'm going to give you a lot of examples here of circumstances where non-epistemic values should play one or the other role. Okay, so the first claim, I think, which I hope you will consider uncontroversial, is that during data collection, research ethical values should influence decisions about how, if at all, you want to change your research questions, and about what data to generate. And research ethical values, they are a type of non-epistemic values, right? And like the values are exemplified by this concern not to harm research participants, to respect their autonomy, to respect their privacy, these kind of things. So I think it's widely agreed that research must be ethically acceptable. But I think that in connection with the use of other data gathering methods, you can actually make sure that your research is ethically acceptable. Make all these decisions pertaining to this prior to the commencement of data collection. And that's why carrying out ethically responsible science is compatible with the ideal of value-free science. Because it doesn't say that you can't have these non-epistemic values influencing prior to data collection. It only says that once you start data collecting, then non-epistemic values are no-go. Okay, so let me give you two examples of how these research ethical values should have an impact on decisions made during qualitative data collection. Remember that I said that you only make decisions about what data to collect once you are, or most of them are made once you are in the field already producing your data. And that means that it's only when you are confronted with various options as to what data you should collect that you may start wondering, okay, if I do this, might this cause harm to the research participants? And of course, if it does, you shouldn't go ahead, and otherwise it's fine, right? Also, if it so happens that you need to go for a new research question, either completely new or some very modified version of your original question, then you must once more consider whether this is likely to cause harm to the research participants. Then there's another sort of value that I think is actually highly underdescribed in the philosophy of social science literature. And the way I'm trying to capture it is to talk about appropriate respect for local norms and customs. And my claim is here that during data collection, appropriate respect for local norms and customs should influence decisions about how, if at all, you should change your research question, and also about what data to generate. So by local norms and customs, I mean like, how do you dress, when do you typically dine, what do you offer guests when they come, do you offer to hold the door for a woman, and all these kind of local norms and customs. And then, of course, I'm talking here about appropriate respect. And I've tried to catch this out, but maybe later you can come with suggestions of how you can do that even more precisely. But I think you could say something like the following, that the qualitative researcher should follow local norms and customs if she is expected or somehow demanded to do so by the research participants, except if she considers this unacceptable on moral, professional, or legal grounds. I mean, it's widely held, for instance, that you should never be part of illegal activities or commit illegal acts yourself just because you are investigating criminals. And then they say, okay, could you please murder this next person for me? I mean, you should say no, and that's considered acceptable, right? So I think that if you read through the literature on qualitative research, it's actually very commonly implicit, but also sometimes explicit, that you have to show this appropriate respect for the locals. If you are allowed to attend a funeral in the community you are looking into, and you know that they show up in black at this occasion, and you show up in your new pink shirt, it's just not okay, right? We wouldn't say it's morally wrong, I think, but in some cases maybe, but two would say that's inappropriate. And I think that researchers are expected to behave appropriately. The point is now that in order to behave appropriately as a researcher and show this respect for local norms and habits, I mean, the decisions that you have to take to ensure this, many of them are taken while you're in the field collecting your data. So one reason for this is the same as before. You have to make decisions while you're in the field about what data to collect. And it's only when you think, okay, maybe I should collect these data, that you can start reflecting on whether doing that would be considered appropriate or appropriately respectful of local norms and customs. Also, if you change your research question, modify it significantly, then you have to consider whether looking into that would be compatible with respecting local norms and customs. So if all of a sudden you decided, well, I would really like to carry out participant observation in connection with people's sex lives, I mean, you might consider, well, my being present during these occasions, would that be considered appropriate? I mean, would I somehow break some local norms and customs? And my guess is that in most places, the answer would be yes, you would definitely. So, I mean, that should be a no-go for you. You should opt for a different questions here, right? Okay, so what I've tried to show so far is that research ethical values and this concern with being appropriately respectful of local norms and habits, they have required roles to play during qualitative data collection. They should influence these choices during data collection. But then I think that within the constraints set by these two values, there are other non-epistemic values that have a variety of permissible roles. And I want now to take you through them. So I think that if you decide to change your research question while you're in the field, so during the data collection phase, then other non-epistemic values may perfectly well influence your decision about what alternative question to adopt. I think it's widely acknowledged in the values or the discussions of values in science, that not only epistemic but also non-epistemic values may affect the choice of research question prior to the commencement of data collection. And it's always prior to the commencement of data collection, because the kind of data gathering methods and ways of doing science that philosophers have looked into have all been the kinds of research where it's at least easier to be under the illusion that you pick your research question and let it stay as you picked it prior to the commencement of data collection. But I think that if we think about it and say, okay, both epistemic and non-epistemic values may have this impact on the choice of research question prior to the commencement of data collection, I think that if we then look at this method, these qualitative methods, where you actually change your research question while you're in the process of collecting data, well, why not also here allow epistemic and non-epistemic values both to play a role? Okay, then there's another situation, and that is when the researcher is in between, not in between jobs, but in between research questions, right? So when you decide in the field, okay, I have to abandon my original research question, what should I do? There might be a period where you actually don't know what should be your research question. And in this situation, I think other non-epistemic values may also influence decisions about what data to collect. So I have worked with a Danish anthropologist at some point, and he went to one of the former Soviet republics and wanted to study shamans. So these people who are in contact with the spirits and so on. And he had read up on the literature, and it sounded like a great topic. He was really prepared. But when he arrived there were no shamans. So they told him, we're sorry, we don't have shamans anymore. It's a tradition we have abandoned, right? And so he was like, okay, I'm here. What should I then look into? So he had a period where he was looking around for questions, or a better research question. And I think that in this situation, of course, it makes no sense to require that the researcher should gather relevant data conducive to a balanced data set. And the reason is, of course, that data are only relevant and data set are only balanced relative to a research question. So absent a research question, well, I mean, what do you do? Now, then there's a situation where you face epistemically equally preferable data. And so here the idea is that these other non-epistemic values may influence decisions about what data to collect. When the researcher faces choices between opportunities for data collection where these data seem equally relevant and they're equally conducive to a balanced data set. Now, this is a very common situation at the beginning of research, and also when your research question is still quite unspecific, right? You may arrive, on the third day in your field, you're looking into nursing practices, and you have the options of either going around with a nurse and see how she's taking care of the patients, or being part of a meeting between a few nurses. Well, it's equally relevant to your research project, and which one do you pick? Well, it doesn't really matter from an epistemic perspective, right? Both are good things to look into. So when there is this kind of, underdetermination by epistemic values, you may use other non-epistemic values as tiebreakers, so to speak. Then there is another feature, and this is the last feature I'm going to point to, of qualitative data collection, and that is that these kind of temporary deviations from the original or the research question at the beginning of research are considered quite acceptable. So it's considered acceptable to let non-epistemic values somehow influence your decision to collect data that are not really relevant or conducive to a balanced set, given your initial research project or your research question, insofar as this is just a small detour where you are still left with enough time to gather your data, or if you later adjust your research question so that these, data that are first not relevant and not conducive to a balanced data set are actually turned into relevant data conducive to a balanced data set because you adjust your research questions. So I think that, again, these kind of deviations, they are very common at the beginning of research, where you're more tentative, more groping around, and where you typically build in room for these kind of temporary deviations. Okay, so here's what I've tried to convince you of so far. Right? I've tried to show that during qualitative data collection, both research ethical values and appropriate respect for local norms and customs should influence decisions about how you, if at all, you change a research question about what data you collect. And then I've tried to show that within the constraints set by these two values, other non-epistemic values may influence decisions about how you change, if at all, your research question, just as they may affect decisions about what data you collect when you are in between questions, when the choice is underdetermined by epistemic values, and when the research question may nonetheless be satisfactorily answered or is subsequently adjusted. So I think that this this value analysis shows that we need to reject the ideal of value-free science as applied to qualitative data collection. And the reason is that I've pointed to a number of legitimate roles that non-epistemic values may play during data collection, but according to the ideal of value-free science, these non-epistemic values have no legitimate role to play here. So we reject the idea. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to these alternative ideals and see if we can get some help from them here. So, I mean, as I mentioned already, a number of these alternative ideals have been advanced, and I mean, yeah, we should look into whether we can use some of them. I'm going to examine three ideals, one by the education scientist Martin Hammersley, and the two others by Douglas and Steele. While Hammersley has social research in mind, in particular, both Douglas and Steele, I mean, I think it's fair to say I've developed their ideals with natural science research in mind, but they have both indicated that they think the ideal applies to social science too. Since, I mean, carrying out qualitative research is a form of social science, then we should expect them to apply here. So I have to admit from the outset that none of the ideals explicitly has anything to say about the role of values when deciding on how, if at all, to change a research question during data collection. But I think we should say, okay, we are prepared to accept that if these ideals at least speak to or correctly capture the role of values when it comes to choices about what data to collect. If they can't say anything sensible on these sort of decisions, I think we should say, okay, you know what, then, I mean, it might be a fine idea, but it will not work as an idea for qualitative data collection. And in fact, this is the conclusion I'm going to arrive at. So let me start with Hammersley's alternative ideal. So according to his ideal, any distortion of the research process by the researcher's own or by others' non-epistemic values should be minimized. So of course it's crucial to understand what he means by distortion here. And what he means is that these non-epistemic values distort the research process when they somehow impede or clash with the attainment of scientific knowledge. So, I mean, according to this ideal, it's fine that you have non-epistemic values actually influencing the process as long as they don't have this distorting effect. So this is granting much more than the ideal of value-free science, because their non-epistemic values could never have any impact. So that's a good sign. But then there are some problems. So research ethical values, they are kind of non-epistemic values, right? And I think they may distort the data collection process in the sense that on research ethical grounds, there may be data you can't collect. So they might be interesting for you to collect in order to answer your research question, but you realize that, okay, there are just some people that I would like to talk to where, I mean, I risk that they are harmed by, say, being seen by me, the social researcher, so I should refrain from talking to them. So you can end up with an unbalanced data set if you abide by these rules or these values. And of course, if you don't change your research question, that's an option. But you can, if you stick to a research question, it will result in an unbalanced data set. And in that sense, you can say that they distort the research process. Well, so Hammers to say then that we should strive to minimize the impact then of research ethical values if we take his ideal to heart. But I don't really know what that means. We should minimize the impact of research ethical values. Well, you shouldn't overdo it, right? You should be over worried about not acting in ethically acceptable ways. But of course, you shouldn't underdo it either, right? You should strike the right balance. So I think that we should say instead that the researchers should do whatever it takes to generate data in an ethically acceptable way, instead of talking about minimization. And in fact, my second problem with this ideal turns a little bit on the same point. Because consider this value that you, this concern that you may have to promote your own career. I mean, that may clearly have a distorting effect on the data collection process. You may think that you should arrive at a certain result, and in order to do that, I mean, it would be highly inconvenient if you talk to a certain group of people, because doing so might probably lead you to arriving at another result, and you don't want to do that. So here the idea holds that you should minimize the influence of this value on the research process. But I think that's strange. No, I mean, the ideal should be that we should prevent this value from influencing the research process. I mean, we are simply setting the bars too low here. And that's exactly also what that is exactly compatible with my prior analysis, because it doesn't allow even minimal influence from these kind of values. Now then there's Buckler's alternative idea, and it has received a lot of attention, I think, in the recent debate on values in science. And her proposal is the following. During the internal phases of research, values should play an indirect role only in connection with decisions about which empirical claims to make. So the internal stages of science, they are roughly from the onset of data collection until the research findings have been established. And the empirical claims, what she has in mind here is how you characterize your raw data. This is an empirical claim, right? Your description of the raw data, your interpretation of these claims, these are also empirical claims, and then your hypothesis. She has mainly hypothesis testing science in mind, so that's why she talks about hypothesis. Then there's a very remarkable feature about this ideal, and it is that it does not rely on the distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic values as relied upon in the classic ideal of value-based science. Instead, the key distinction here is that between playing direct and indirect roles in research. And a value plays a direct role when it determines decisions in and of itself. So it is, it has a direct impact on what you decide. Whereas it has an indirect role when the value is used to assess whether the reasons in support of a decision are sufficient. So you may ask yourself, how much evidence do I need before I will accept this hypothesis, for instance? And values may here play an indirect role if you say, well, if I, it's very important that I get this right because otherwise a lot of people will die from eating a certain plant, for instance. So you say, I want to set the bars high here because it will have terrible social consequences if I'm actually wrongly saying that this hypothesis is confirmed. So this is a more indirect role. So let's then see how we can apply this ideally to qualitative data collection. So one option is to say, well, choices about what data to collect are not really examples of decisions about which empirical claims to make. That's all she's talking about, these decisions. So if that's the case, well, then the ideal has really nothing to tell us here, right? It doesn't speak to qualitative data collection. So another more ingenious way, perhaps, to go about it is to say, well, choices about what data to collect are instances of decisions of which empirical claims to make, because when you decide what data to collect, you kind of narrow down the scopes of doings and sayings and so on that you will look at and so eventually make claims about in your field notes and interview transcripts and so on. So there's a kind of sort of a choice of what claims you will eventually make. So then the idea would apply, right, to data collection. But then it's just plain wrong. Because as I showed a second ago, research ethical values and appropriate respect for local norms, for instance, should directly influence choices made during data collection about what data to collect. Because if you think that it is going to be harmful for research participants, if you somehow are seen with them somewhere, you should refrain from, say, seeking them out in this situation. And that would be values directly influencing what data you collect. And they're not supposed to directly influence during the internal phases. According to Douglas's ideal, that is something you should refrain from allowing to happen. Okay, so let's hope for the last idea. So the last idea has been advanced by Dan Steele quite reasonably, and what he claims is the following. Non-epistemic values should not conflict with epistemic values in the design or interpretation of scientific research that is practically feasible and ethically permissible. And what Steele does is he returns or retains the distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic values and refines it. But for our purposes, we can just stick to his broad characterization of epistemic values. So epistemic values are ones that promote the attainment of truth, whereas non-epistemic values don't do so. Now, as he spells it out, the design of research covers the methods and procedures that generate data. So I think it's reasonable to hold that these decisions about what data to collect are kind of design decisions. So, so far so good. His ideal does have something to say about the role of values in these decisions. So the question is, of course, if what it says is correct. So I think it isn't for two reasons. And one reason is that when deciding what data to collect, the researcher should not only make sure that it's ethically permissible to go ahead and collect these data. That's the thing that Steele's ideal would agree in. But also, you should make sure that collecting these data are permissible from the perspective of being appropriately respectful of local norms and customs. And I don't think, as it stands, that Steele's ideal can accommodate that, because it doesn't operate at all with these values in the form of respect for a local norm and the customs. So it doesn't completely capture what is at stake in this situation. And then there's another problem too. And it is that other non-epistemic values, as I argued also, may temporarily conflict with epistemic values, right? You may be outraged about how children are treated, and that make you go into a small deviation, or to deviate from your research question. You may start looking into this somehow. But it's okay. I mean, if you're at the beginning of your research and there's still enough time to, go back looking into your initial research question and get enough data, or if you later adjust your research question so that all of a sudden you start looking into something related to how children are treated, say. And this flexibility in the way you typically carry out qualitative research is not accommodated by Steele's ideal either, because it doesn't allow these non-epistemic values to have this impact. They should always be overruled by epistemic values, according to this idea. So here's where we end. I mean, not my talk, but my discussion of these six ideas, right? It is that none of them are really fitting alternative or substitute ideals for the ideal of value-free science. So, what then? Well, we are then in the situation that we are, in a sense, in need of an ideal, right? Because the ideal of value-free science applied to qualitative data collection, it doesn't give us any guidance, or the guidance it gives us is just wrong. If we look at how qualitative research is commonly practiced. And the same goes for these three alternative ideas. Either they don't really speak to the situations as it presents itself for the qualitative data collector, or it gives the wrong advice. So what we need to do then is to develop a new ideal for qualitative data collection. And then you may wonder, but how should we go about that task? And here's what I would suggest. I would say that the analysis that I have provided you with here about the role of values and decisions about how, if at all, to change your research questions and about what data to collect is a first step. But it's only a first step, right? We should also try to analyze, so what are the proper roles of values in relation to other decisions made during qualitative data collection? So there would be some kind of thinking and looking into qualitative research so that you might provide a proper analysis and an answer to this question. Then it's not obvious either that the new ideal should rest on this traditional distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic values. I have used it here because it was very convenient for me, because I was showing you that the ideal of value-free science should be rejected, and they rely on this distinction. But as I told you, Steele has considerably refined the distinction, further developed it. And then there are people like Douglas who claim that we should completely forget about this distinction. It's more important to talk about direct or indirect roles, and there might be other options. I think that however we decide to in a sense, distinguish between values when we are to look into the role of values in science, I think that you can just reformulate my analysis in these new terms, if we do need new terms. But in any event, this is a question that needs to be addressed, because it is somewhat controversial, or it's disputed that you should rely on this traditional distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic values. So I think once you have confronted these two questions, then I think that you're in a position to formulate a new ideal. And this means that I'm ending on a note saying, here's a lot of work to be done. So let's go ahead. Thank you for your time. Well, uh, I haven't worked this ideal out yet, but I think that we have to recognize that the kind of research represented by qualitative research in the social sciences and humanities is a very different way of doing research than you do in many fields in the natural sciences, or at least as philosophers have portrayed how you carry out research in the natural sciences. So I think that if we start looking into this, we will see, due to the whole flexibility of the whole setup, both, I mean, what you look at and the research question and so on, we will find that there is a role for non-epistemic values, if we go with that kind of notion, that we don't see in connection with other sciences and more natural science kinds of research. But I should also say that this is maybe not the whole picture, because I think that it's slowly also being recognized that when you carry out natural science research, you do have in the beginning of the research where you are faced where you're much more probing. You're much more tentative. You haven't really started on the big research yet, or the real research, but you're testing out an experiment, or you're testing out a questionnaire and so on. And there I think you can find some of the same flexibility that you find in qualitative research. But the thing is just that, well, if we look at, for instance, quantitative social research, you have this testing period, but then once the real research starts, you go into being very unflexible, right? You have the questions for your questionnaire, you go ahead and so on. But I think in this beginning phase, there may be a lot of similarity here. So that would be my hunch. So I'm not really capable of answering the question, except hinting. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, I think that we should acknowledge that you know, researchers are moral beings, and political beings and so on, and you may simply uh, also be puzzled about something because it's the political system or way about you go about things are so different from how you think it should be done that may make you curious. You may be outraged about something. There is a very famous example that Michael Root also has discussed, a philosopher of social science, where researchers started looking into battering of women. And they were really, so they discovered there was this domestic violence, and it wasn't really what they were out there to look into in the first place, as I remember it. But they were, you know, they thought we need to get this out in the open, and that strikes me as a perfectly, that's perfectly acceptable way, and I think we do that all the time. There are lots of different things can motivate what we take up. Sometimes there are external constraints. We get a grant for looking into something, right? And then that constrains what we can look into. But there are also other times, or even within such a framework, where you can make adjustments and look into something. And I think we should recognize, that there are all sorts of reasons for questions being significant. And that's what scientists should look into, right? Significant questions. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. 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 Well, thank you for all your questions. I will start from the end. So I think it is. It's always tricky with this harm thing, right? Because the notion or idea that you shouldn't harm research participants comes from bioethical or biomedical research, right? And also doctors, they shouldn't harm their patients, and you shouldn't harm them when you carry out these kind of medical experiments. And there's a way in which harm in the medical context, well, it's physical harm, typically, right? But once you move into the social sciences, there are a variety of types of harm, right? You can have psychological harm, you can have social harm, of course, also physical harm, economic harm, and so on. And the question is how you also determine when people are harmed. Is it a kind of, are they harmed if they feel immediately shocked and a little repelled by a question? But then, in the long run, it was really good for them to reflect on it. I don't really know. I think it is extremely complicated to determine these kind of things. But I think that despite that, it is useful to talk about that you shouldn't harm research participants, though it may then be very difficult in practice to determine what to count as harm and so on and so forth. So it is complicated to do research in an ethically acceptable way, I think, or demanding. The other thing you raised is that, well, sometimes shouldn't we say that the value of attaining the knowledge outweighs the harm we do to research participants, right? We could maybe consider these kind of situations where we have to balance one against the other. And I think that it's true that there may perhaps be situations in which we say, okay, we should harm in order to get the knowledge. But there, I think there are a whole series of considerations you have to go through before you can actually justify harming research participants. It's not something you should just do. It has to do with the extent of the harm, right? How much are they really harmed by this? How important is the knowledge really? Could you obtain this knowledge by way of another method that wouldn't result in the same kind of harm, and so on and so forth? And I definitely don't want to exclude the possibility that sometimes we should say that, yeah, the harm is so minimal. So quite frankly, let's get this knowledge. But I do think it's the exception. So, but you're right, the claim should be that generally speaking, typically, we should try not to harm research participants, or that's prima facie. What we should do, or avoid to do, is to harm them, but that there might be occasions where we could justify doing it, taking a whole variety of factors into consideration. And then your first question. So the way I understood it is that, like, respect for local norms and customs. Yes, and so I think that in one way, you could say that, well, could it sometimes be a moral value? Could it be, should you respect them because it would be morally wrong of you not to respect local norms and customs? And I think, yes, there will be cases where we would say it's morally wrong, right? Not to do it. You can imagine a situation in which you are working in a community and you have to show up at this party, and there's a lot of potential harm done to the host if you show up completely inappropriately dressed. Yet you just show up completely inappropriately dressed, right? I mean, here we could say, okay, maybe you are harming to the extent where it's a moral wrong you are committing, right? But I think that many cases, I mean, if you show up in the wrong outfit, it's not morally wrong, right? It's something less than that. It's just inappropriate. So unless we work with an extremely inclusive notion of harm, I think that there are cases where it's not a moral, many cases where it's not a moral wrong. But then you raised another point too, and that is whether actually we should look at this respect for local norms and habits as actually sometimes also an epistemic value, right? Because respecting local norms and habits might actually be conducive to the generation of data that you need because people don't get annoyed with you. They start inviting you in to all kinds of events because they see you trying to blend in and so on. So I think that certain, like respecting local norms and values could sometimes be an epistemic, sometimes a non-epistemic value, or maybe both. It's not a situation that is that's possible to describe within the traditional distinction of epistemic and non-epistemic values, in the sense that people seem to assume there that it's either always an epistemic value or either always a non-epistemic value. But I think that still, in his refinement of this distinction, he actually takes hand of exactly this problem because he distinguishes between robust and contingent epistemic and non-epistemic values. So, contingent epistemic values are values that in certain contexts promote the attainment of truth, and in other contexts fail to do that. And if we start sophisticating the distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic values, I think we have to admit that sometimes respecting norms and habits could also be an epistemic value. But I actually think that for the technical research, ethical value is probably right. I mean, that seems that you are very considerate as a researcher of how many people might also benefit your knowledge production. But I think that it won't be like that in all situations. Respecting local norms and customs might not benefit you from the perspective of generating knowledge. It might not be conducive to that. So that you have to recognize that it's a non-epistemic value in that context. Yet, it should still influence the way you act towards the research participants. So I think your point, if you refine the distinction, is correct, but I still think it leaves intact the point that when it only functions as when it functions as a non-epistemic value, it should sometimes, in that capacity, influence what data you decide to collect. That turned into a long one.